most people may kind of potentially think to themselves that, what's the relevance of this to me? And I kind of touched on that in a number of the presentations that we've had over the last 2 days. But you may not be in a situation where you're designing projects to the scale that Blair and DKO are, and you may not have offices spread around the globe. But some of the lessons that I guess you can take away from this presentation are how you adapt the situations that DKO have experienced and how you can implement similar processes to enable you to document your larger projects or handle projects across multiple offices. So it's an adaptive presentation, I guess, depending upon you and your own organisation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Blair and let him get underway.
Hopefully this is working. Good.
Can't hear you from across the ditch.
Okay, that's entirely fine. First off, thanks for the invite. I'm still ambivalent as to whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. But we'll good? Don't get me started. It's your mic. Do I need to talk down like this? Anyway, thank you. So hopefully there's some takeaways here from you. We tend to do things in quite large scale. Hopefully when I get to the end of the presentation, there's a few learnings and things there which will apply equally to a small office with maybe different components to it even, if not actually spread across Australia or internationally. Going very brief agenda, a little bit about DKO, a little bit about me, why we started going down this path. Are we lagging? Okay. Let me just press this button and see what happens. There we are, look at that. Thanks. Button 1. So a little bit about DKO, a little bit about me, why we started down the path of doing multi-office documentation. I probably struggled a bit with the content on this as to what it actually was. I'm going to call it a broad case study because it's pretty much 5 years of us trying different things and seeing what worked and adapting to different conditions. So it's very much, I suppose, a bit of a journey for us as to where we're at now and where we've come from. So I'll go through a couple of things we learnt and some key points in regards to what we've found's definitely worked and what hasn't worked along the way. So a little bit about DKO. We're spread primarily Australia. We've got a few bodies scattered around remotely, but primarily Melbourne's the primary office. We've got about 90, Sydney's 45. We've currently got 30 in Ho Chi Minh. That's grown pretty rapidly over the years. We've got 3 lonely souls lurking around in Christchurch, and we've got about 10 in Auckland. We've got a few remote workers around as well. We've got some scattered around New Zealand and Australia, but they tend to just kind of bolt on to a nearest major office. So a little bit about me, as it gets pointed out fairly regularly, I'm a Kiwi by origin. You probably picked that up fairly quickly accent-wise. That being said, I've been here 19 years now, 20 years in Melbourne. Backgrounds as an architectural technician, came out of CPIT in Christchurch, moved to Australia for a couple of years to get some work experience. Started working at Woods Bagot. First job I was on was a 40-storey commercial building, which from doing house renos and minor stuff was a learning curve. But we had some good teams and learned a lot through that time. Then eventually moved across to DKO, which is it's actually 15 years this month, which is a fairly long time in architecture world to be anywhere. Tried to move away a couple of times, always ended up coming back with that. Primarily, most of those years I spent running projects, definitely more a technical delivery side of things. I'm a really shitty designer, much better with computers and things. and went through a bit of a phase there where we were struggling for some BIM management. I've kind of naturally always fallen into that role. People ask me a lot of questions, and eventually it sort of became formalised sort of 5 years ago. And I like data-related stuff. So it's anything along those lines. Doesn't necessarily need to be BIM. Sometimes it's Excel. Yeah. Anyway, it makes a lot more sense than the people you're trying to teach to use the computer. So a little bit about what we're doing in regards to stuff of scale. Marina Tower's a nice shiny sunset one. If you install 23, you'll get a little glimpse of that as it pops up because of us asking nicely and Graphisoft doing a bit of marketing. The middle one with all the roundy sort of ones is City Gardens in Ho Chi Minh, which I'll touch on that shortly. That was basically the foundation of why we have a Ho Chi Minh office. Okay, Elmstone and then Peel by Milieu. This is pretty much bread and butter for DKO's large-scale apartment blocks. It's an interesting realm to be in because at the moment the market gets any jitters, the developers tend to get pretty freaked out and stop work on stuff, usually refuse to pay their last bill as well. So we've done a lot of that over the years. That's been, I suppose, all our big projects have all been along those lines. Student accommodation, something that we've seen a lot of in the last probably 5 years. Huge market for that in Melbourne, especially, Sydney as well, but Melbourne, there seems to be large organisations that will pair up with Melbourne Uni, RMIT, and we'll do things. The middle one's last project I worked on is a 500-bed student accommodation block in Latrobe Street in Melbourne CBD. That was the last kind of actual project I worked on for a few years ago. And we've done a few churches as well. We tend to have some fairly close ties with churches through Coast to Geyser, our principal. So I was running out of good pictures here, so I've got some rubbish ones, I'm afraid. The top left is Saint A Apartments. So basically, all of that land will be developed over the next few years. It's right on the train line, but there's about, I think, 400 odd dwellings in that area. We do a lot of that as well. We do a lot of master planning subdivisions, and then we do design guides, typologies, and we'll quite often extend into doing builders packs, which are basically a building permit set with some finishes and things, working with Australand, Stockland, those sort of things. All of the stuff we do tends to be very, very modular, whether it's kind of flat across townhouses or whether it's tall stuff. And that drives a lot of how we document things and how we treat our files. Quick rundown, before my time, but 2000 Archicad and DKO, DKO was formed. There were about 4 PCs ad hoc linked together. If you wanted to work on a file, you had to sit at that PC. It was pretty ugly back then. I came in around 2005. They had some team working. Mostly it was all just solo files. We were on a really hideous network. When somebody sent an email, you could hear it go down the line across the office as they daisy chained all the switches. Progressively, we got a bit better. I think Teamwork 2.0 and version 13 was kind of a massive change for the industry. For anyone using Archicad, you didn't have to send and receive the entire file anymore. That opened things up a little bit. The Sydney office probably started around that time. Primarily it's been Melbourne office. Sydney office has been around for a while, but it was very low-key, couple of people. And then sort of we go through versions. We tend to skip versions rather than try and roll out a new template, new everything every year. The timing of these things can be a bit sporadic. Like obviously 22 was, reasonably on time. 23 they didn't release for a number of months afterwards. We're still mucking around with 20 at the moment to try and get that. Oh, sorry, 23 for this year. I'm fortunate to have Damien and Moyes here at the moment. We're doing a workshop tomorrow, so Saturday mornings getting our shit together for 2020 workshop where we go through that. So this is kind of where we're sitting. I tried to come up with a graphic that would actually make some sense. So we're sitting just bobbling around under the 200 mark. We've got a few remote workers who don't live in an office, so they're not on this. But we went through a pretty stupid period around 2016 where things got pretty hectic, and we were trying to find staff anywhere we could possibly find them with varying results. That was also about the time I somewhat lost it trying to run the BIM management entirely by myself, which once you get to 150 people gets to be a bit silly. So I had Melbourne and Sydney BIM managers come on board at that point. And you can see that the purple one, the Ho Chi Minh office, has definitely grown in the last few years as well through that. I really didn't know where to put this slide, but I've chucked it in anyway. The cost and speed of internet providers in Australia has been, there's been a phenomenal shift in the last few years. That when we look at what we were paying back in 2013 for, I think that was a 5x5 internet connection, maybe a 10x10 at that point, which now we look at, and if we're not getting that at home, everybody's horrified because there's no Netflix. And then we paid a bit more. So this is between Melbourne and Sydney offices. Through that, we've generally always had the same connection speeds in the offices. And then around 2016, we jumped up to 100x100, which was fantastic. Everybody was over the moon with that. We maybe foolishly moved both our Melbourne and Sydney offices last year in September, October and November. Moving 2 offices in the space of 3 months, don't do that. It's a really bad idea. It was pretty awful. Pretty much wiped out all the management and things, the level of organisation for that. On the upside though, we're now running 1,000 by 1,000 fibre in both the offices and paying less than we were for our 10x10 connection not so many years ago. It's becoming far more prevalent. There's a lot more suppliers putting down fibre, especially anywhere CBD area. And we've found that you've just got to keep your eyes open because there are deals and it's usually not Telstra providing those things, or if they are, they're providing them at a huge cost. It's quite often a IINet, TPG, somebody, an off-brand, which are quite often just reselling Telstra's infrastructure for them. Okay, so why did we end up documenting stuff across all the offices? And we're pretty fluid about where we document stuff now. The home office is always going to be the base one. What we've found, and I'll go into it shortly, is that with any architecture practice, once you get a certain amount of bums and seats, ironing out the ebbs and flows of workload can be pretty hard. The directors are very keen on trying to keep the right staff, and if your office has lost work, there's a downturn, you either have to lay people off or you go broke. There's not really too many other options there. And what we've found is we've got a number of offices around. We've managed to balance our workload a bit to try and pick up the slack. It's not actually a major issue at the moment. Mostly we need more people to work for us. But we do find that things go up and down, especially being in a developer-driven industry. Most of our clients are developers, and they tend to, any jitters in the industry, they tend to put the brakes on pretty quick, and they'll just land bank stuff, which could mean you've got a team of 5 working on something, and then tomorrow they're not working on anything, which if it happens all in a row can be an issue. So there's definitely a push to retain staff rather than trying to shed staff. I know there's some other firms around who tend to treat their staff very much like a serial number, and they have you on contract and they expand and contract pretty rapidly. There's not a lot of heart or soul involved in that. The other thing is that over the years, the fee levels that we're getting across the industry are less than we were ever getting. The margins are getting tighter. There's generally an expectation that because we have these new fancy fast computers, we can document stuff fast, and therefore we don't need as much time, therefore we don't need as much money to do it. And there's definitely a lot of undercutting. Architects are their own worst enemy in that regards. I sat on a panel November last year with a couple of other very big name architecture firms, and everyone around the table said, yeah, it's acknowledged that in the day, if you've got 40 people that you need to keep working, you'll drop the fee to just get the work in the door. And unfortunately, the AA don't tend to provide a strong guidance on that. There's no union as such. And you quite often find even big brand name firms are actually undercutting each other, which you wouldn't expect considering the brand name attached to them. And the other drive we found is that we can, basically, the internet access now, short of not the Wi-Fi that we're getting here, but the landlines, we can more actively share files across offices, and it's no revolutionary technology that we absolutely need to have to make that work. Quite often you just need a decent internet connection and a bit of analysis as to how to structure your firewalls and things, and that beyond that, everything is possible. So a quick little summary of what we've got. So we've had Melbourne-Sydney linked since pretty much we had Melbourne-Sydney offices. We had, so Q1, 6x6 it was there. We didn't really do a lot of sharing at that point. It was really more of an access thing. We've got a centralised admin drive. Because Melbourne's always been the primary office, generally we store administration documents there with that. But at those sort of speeds, you'd copy and paste a PLN across and wait for it to go, and then you could work on it later, but you certainly wouldn't be trying to open a file from one office to the next. As of 2014, when we upgraded to 10x10, it was vaguely acceptable, but if you had a file of any size, any Photoshop files or InDesign or things like that, don't even bother, just quite often end up Dropboxing it across, because Dropbox actually handles the transfer of data better than Windows Explorer backend, which is frightful. And then Q3, we went up to 100x100. At that point, I think 2016, we got some new switchgear in there. It's right there. Sophos, which is basically a collection of devices, which are all firewalls. So even our internal Wi-Fi's are on that. So if you go from office to office with your DKO device, you can log in pretty much anywhere as long as you're inside the bubble. 2015, we had a small Auckland office which moved from I suppose we'd sublet within a town planner's office and got our own office there. They're very fortunate. They're pretty much sitting on top of the fibre hub in Auckland, so they had much better speeds than we had pretty much from day one. So the issue linking our offices and Auckland were, definitely always at our end rather than theirs. And then in 2016, we'd linked to the Ho Chi Minh office. The Ho Chi Minh office basically was subletting preceding that, and we were just kind of bolting on to an engineer's office. We had about 4 or 5 people at that point. So a couple of options. The internet in Vietnam, and I do apologise because this is quite focused on Vietnam, because this is kind of, I suppose, our journey and what's prompted a lot of what we do now, and we've moved this information or these processes back to other offices as well. But Vietnam was the catalyst for us because it was the hardest thing. The Vietnamese internet is not great, to say the least. It collapses quite regularly. The information we had when we went first into our new office was basically you've got to get 2 internet lines, make sure they're 2 separate lines from 2 separate suppliers, because once a week it'll just drop out and you've got no idea when it'll come back. The other oddball thing about the Vietnamese internet is their local internet is quite fast. Their international internet is generally rubbish. And when you buy a plan from your ISP there, they give you a domestic and international speed. So it's not an upload-download, it's basically here's your international speed, which is this, and then your local speed. So 2016, those are the options we had available to us, basically $250 a month or $1,700 a month. We wanted the clean speed 10 megabits per second, which is pretty astronomical when you look at what you get for it. We moved offices in 2018, and you can see that the price and speed, there's a substantial shift between the two of them. They've had a lot of development internally within their ISPs. And as much as it says 3 for the international speeds for the primary line on the VDOR one, we're quite regularly getting far more than that. They guarantee 3, but we're getting 20 to 30 quite regularly for overseas connections. Why do we have a Vietnam office, and why do we use them for documentation of Melbourne projects and Sydney projects reasonably regularly now? This is City Gardens. This one almost fell into our lap. So we were involved in the master plan of this a long time ago. Tower 1, which is the far right, the local architects then did a floor plan and did this. It sold really badly. The floor plans that they'd put in there were very traditional Vietnamese, stuff that if you're in Vietnam, your grandparents might sort of feel comfortable in with the way that they laid out the internals. Quite often they had the kitchens on the balconies. It sold really badly. So the developer who we were dealing with over there came back to us and said, can you do a peer review of the floor plans? It's just not working. We can't build any more towers because we're not going to make any money. We recut the floor plans. By we, I mean not me. Not my job. And so Tower 2 and 3, which are the ones on the right, which are the co-joined ones there, we'll recut all the floor plans, but they went out to market with Tower 2 and 3. And they got basically interest, I think it was around 80% in the first month that they pre-sold off the plan. So across the board, there's about 1,400 apartments across all those. So they were immensely pleased with that, obviously, and they wanted us to work on the job. So we went from basically having Coase, our principal, over there occasionally and dealing with these guys to finding people rapidly and founding an office. And the first stage of that was we basically plonked one of the guys from the Melbourne office and some locals into the engineering firm and just grabbed a couple of desks in their office and sat in there and they just started drawing. That was it, basically. Got some computers, got a couple of Archicad licenses, and it was a bit frantic and a bit messy. And once that got underway, pretty rapidly moved from that to having an office of about 10 or 12 people immediately. Vietnam's a little bit tricky. They've got some pretty unusual processes to get a building permit. Because we weren't founded in Vietnam as a company at the time and didn't have the correct certification, we couldn't actually do the final construction documents ourselves, so we had to outsource that to a local drafting firm. So we did it all in Archicad, shelled it out in DWG, they put it on their title blocks, Vietnamesed some of the text that we hadn't already Vietnamesed, because obviously Archicad doesn't have a Vietnamese localization, it's all in English. So you can put the text in Vietnamese, but all the menus and things are all in English, which makes, we've found good staff over there, so it hasn't been too much of an issue. But that went absolutely nuts for a while. And then that tapered off pretty rapidly. So we had an office full of staff with not much to do at that point. We hadn't founded a lot of other work. We had some smaller stuff going on, mostly design stuff. So we had to make a call then. Do we shut the office or cull it down to a couple of staff? Or do we try and keep them on board and prop them up doing some other work from somewhere else? This is our pilot project for Vietnam. 434 apartments in Box Hill, which probably wouldn't have been my recommended sort of first tab at sharing a file across nations. It's an absolute monster. If you remember that graph when we were going up through that, we just simply couldn't find enough people to document things. We couldn't get enough people. We'd run out of room in the Melbourne office. We'd sublet a small office around the corner. We didn't quite have bunk bed desks at that point, but it was joked about. So at that point, obviously the project architects are screaming out for staff. So we took a bit of a punt and we said, listen, let's try and send some of the documentation packages across to get the guys in Vietnam to do. Obviously, there's a whole conversation around using foreign staff. I know there's offices in Manila and Vietnam for big firms in Australia. There's definitely I suppose a cost benefit to doing that. In Australian dollars, on average, you're looking probably a quarter of the cost of an Australian architect. Bearing in mind that in a Vietnamese scenario is definitely above average pay. Not blowing our own trumpet, but we're definitely an employer of choice in Ho Chi Minh. We pay above grade, we've got a good office environment. And there's the whole conversation about, are they just doing our donkey work for us? Having been over there a few times, and most of our directors have been over there, it feels like another DKO office. It's certainly not a sweatshop. They're not making Nike shoes under the desks in the lunch hours. They go out for beers almost any night of the week. They're a good bunch of guys, and they're all accomplished either technicians or registered architects over there. You walk in the office, it feels like a DKO office. It's actually got a heart and a soul to it. And I know that from the director's point of view, they didn't want to be setting up a sweatshop over there just do our plans, we don't care, just get them back to us tomorrow type thing. So there's always a little bit of conflict there. Yes, there's a financial benefit. It's not probably as cut and dried as we just send it over there, it'll cost us half the price to do that, because there's more communication involved. There's definitely a penalty not being in the same office and being able to lean across and go, can you just release that for me, please? So we ploughed on with this, and this is kind of the foundation of, I suppose, the case study as to how we did stuff. If you read the handout, you've got to Google sharks eating undersea cables. It's pretty funny. It's a thing. And when the guys over there told me about it, I'm like, yeah, sharks eating cables. It is actually a thing. Google are now wrapping all their cables in extra carbon Kevlar layers because sharks do nibble on undersea cables. Something about the electromagnetic pulse, but if you Google it, there's YouTube clips on there, it's pretty funny. So first thing we tried was just dumbly, let's just hook up the VPN, because we've got these Sophos firewall boxes. They all talk to each other as a web effectively across all the offices. That was really bad. You could get in the file after a time and you could look at stuff. The send-receive times were pretty awful. The big kicker is it's not so much sending, receiving as far as download speed goes. It's all about ping time. The latency is the absolute marker for everything you do with teamwork. That if you have a look, there's not a white paper, but in the Archicad help guide, amongst the 4 million pages, there's actually some network connectivity things in there. If you look up that, basically they say it should be less than a millisecond if you're in the office, and that's good, and anything more than 5 is a bit scratchy, and anything more than 50 is probably not very good. 285.30 is completely unworkable. You get data dropping out, corruption, and then you come up with that magic screen that tells you you're going to have to discard and reload the file, which when you're pulling a 3 gig file through the eye of a needle and sharks, it's it's pretty painful. So we went through this because it was kind of, I was tasked with finding a means of doing this and would it even be possible to do, because we knew that their internet was not great and not reliable. The power goes out pretty regularly as well. We're in a nice new building now, it's okay, but the first office, weekly the power would go out. So yeah, not ideal. So second thing we tried to do was a RDP, so we'd have at least 1, if not 2 or 3 people in the Melbourne office. Primarily 1, the project architect, would then be remote desktoping to Vietnam. And so he'd virtually occupy a desk in the Vietnam office, which was great. Send receive times, obviously it's right next to the server, literally meters away, and right next to the staff. However, the interface through remote desktop is patchy at best. It tends to, you'll get dropouts where remote desktop will just sit there and you'll get a bit of a spinning wheel for a while and then it'll come back up. The big issue is the lag on screen, that trying to pan or zoom or click on anything with snap points is not impossible, but it's pretty close. So we tried to get that working, couldn't get it to work. It just, it was, as a day-to-day user thing, was pretty much unworkable. So after much faffing around and trying to get things working, we had a look to see what we could do. And because of this weird idiosyncrasy of the Vietnam internet, where you have a local bubble basically and have great internet in that bubble, and then you go outside that bubble and it drops down massively. All the switchgear, all the routing and everything is all owned by the government. They are not great fans of huge amounts of data coming and going. It's not quite North Korea or China, but we have noticed when there's been civil unrest that the internet speeds, the international connections drop rapidly. I've got no data to back this up, but that's generally the word on the street. And from dealing with the guys there, they said, yeah, absolutely every time something goes wrong, they tend to crank up the filtering or crank down the capacity on these switches and routers, and the international internet drops out to the point where it's drip-fed, dial-up kind of thing. But what we found is Hong Kong actually is inside that little safe bubble. So after a lot of hunting around via trying to find virtual servers on AWS or Azure or things, we settled on a company called Elastic Hosts, which are actually Australian based, but they've got a data center in Hong Kong. So I don't know how many trial accounts I had for these things. I think about 6 running at one time, trying to use different data centers and servers around. That was the one that came up the best. And we actually had some pretty good ping times between the offices. And we settled on Hong Kong because it's very much weighted numbers. If you've got 10 people in one office and 4 people in another office, you've really got to try and cater for the 10, because at the end of the day, you've got to inconvenience the least amount of people the least often to be the most efficient. And for the Sky One project, it was primarily 1 or 2 people in Melbourne, and we had 4 or 5 in the Vietnam office. So set up a BIM server on a virtual server hanging out in Hong Kong in a data center there. Reasonably cheap, $300 a month rental for that, which includes the Windows licensing, unlimited internet. And if you do go down this path, make sure you get a static IP, because one day the BIM server just completely disappeared and nobody could find it. As I went in through the management portal for the server itself, everything was running, couldn't figure it out. There'd been a restart to apply some patches, and it had reset the IP address of the server. So nobody could find it. So for the extra $9 a month to get a static IP, something I should have known, it's in the instructions, but yeah, that was Yeah, bit of a learning curve on that one. So we hosted Sky One on there, which was, I think, at peak, probably about 3 gig worth of BIM server file on there, just raw on the BIM server, not PLN. And maximum would have probably about 8 people in there at one time. That ran pretty smoothly. We ran that for, I think, close to 2 years as we went through, right from doing concrete set-out plans, early works packages and things, right through to finishing the job, and then migrated it eventually back to the Melbourne server for the last bit of contract admin. That was pretty successful, and it alleviated the point-to-point issues we were having from there. A couple of points to note. If you ever go with a cloud server of any description, make sure you have a cloud backup somewhere, because you can't go and plug a USB external drive. There's no tape drive. Rescuing stuff if it goes down is pretty much impossible, because you can't stroll into the server and press the power button with that. Fairly simple, use Dropbox. What we did get caught out with though is the moment that the auto backup hits, Dropbox recognises that, and then Dropbox basically monopolises your bandwidth. So we, for the first sort of week or so there, had these massive dropouts. Nobody could send and receive. I'm looking at the server, it's fine. It was just Dropbox basically gobbling up all the bandwidth, so nobody could send and receive at that point. So we set up a script to basically have a monitored folder, so 3 a.m. our time in the morning. It would copy all the backups across into that folder. Dropbox could absolutely blitz the internet. Nobody knew about it because they were all asleep. And so we had our backups. Only downside with that is we were getting backups once a day. So if something did absolutely go horribly awry, we were going to lose up to a day's worth of work, which, given the pressures on the file and deadlines and things, that was a little bit scary. Thankfully, nothing ever happened. It was fine. The data center that it was in was good. But the ability to have it sitting in a Dropbox and then be able to pluck that file out and then reshare it on the Melbourne, Sydney server, any of the other servers pretty quickly, meant that we weren't really going to lose a lot of time on that. And the other thing is, if you're on a publicly accessible server like that, make sure the firewall's in place and you lock down absolutely everything. Thankfully, never had any issues, but if you've got an open IP address, then there's potential for breaches, which could go very badly. As of late 2018, this one here, there's a subforum.org or something, I can't remember the name of the website. I spent a fair bit of time following this. They note any issues with the undersea cables. If you type in Vietnam and undersea cable down, this website comes up with lots of articles because it happens. The AAG, which is the main one in and out that we traverse there on, fails regularly. It's not just sharks, it's actually boat anchors mostly, but sharks is more amusing. So whenever anything starts going badly, I'll generally have a quick look to see what the news feed's saying, to see whether that's a noticeable thing. They did some really major repairs late 2018. If you look at the article, it says June 4th, 2008. It was after that by the time it was actually done. That for us negated the need to have a satellite cloud server. We can just go point to point. 150 milliseconds is actually pretty good, despite what you might read in the literature, where they say anything above sort of 100 is pretty much danger, critical issues. That sat pretty much stable at 150 to 160 for quite some time. Perfectly usable. I don't think I've got the stats there, but the opening a 2 gig file across that network there, you were looking probably about 12 minutes. Send receive times in the seconds, not minutes. Things like going in and reserving layer sets, you're looking 20, 30 seconds. A little bit laggy, but I think the primary benefit is that you're using your computer to do the actual work, because when you're working on Archicad, most of what you do, even in a teamwork file, is directly interfaced with the cache file on your PC. And if that works well, then from a user point of view, everything's going well. People understand that if you're sending receiving to the Vietnam server, it's going to take a little while. Mentally, that's not an issue. We have looked at the Citrix path, which is not feasible from a user point of view. Virtualizing desktops on a server via Citrix has, we've had a number of people try to sell us over the years. Fundamentally, the lag on screen, which is not quite imperceptible but is small, causes major frustration because every time you drag the mouse across, Archicad's got its own cursors. In a Word, Excel, Outlook environment, Citrix works really well, but there's a thing called server rendered cursors. So if your thin client doesn't have those cursors loaded into it, which it won't do because it's not got Archicad installed on it, the server has to generate the cursor and then send that down the line, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think in Archicad, if you pan or zoom or drag your mouse across, every time it hits across here, the cursor changes, and that's not a standard Windows cursor. Every time you alt-click on something, anytime you try and snap to anything, that cursor's got to get generated by the server and then send it down the line to your thin client. The overhead that creates in a CAD environment is huge. And when you're trying to work at speed and snap to things like a corner of a wall, and that cursor is half a second late, you've already actually gone past that snap point by the time the cursor appears on your screen. So I've had some interesting conversations recently with people who've got firms who are trying to push that because the metrics look good. The send receive times, because you've got a desktop virtualized on the server, send receive times, updating, all those things, fast. Fine. But from an actual workability point of view, it drives people nuts because you can't quite work out why nothing's working when you click on stuff and there's just a little lag there. From a user interface point of view, and when you've got 40 people all trying to work via that system and all losing their minds, that's their peace of mind and their productivity is far more valuable than some metrics over here. So it's not a system that we've seriously entertained at any point. We'd much rather have people using a PC actually at their desk, and most of the processes you do in teamwork are still based on your PC until you exchange data with the PC. Sorry, I'll go back here. So this is all good. That's pretty much what we're running now with a little tweak. The big kicker for us is that works great for teamwork files. What we're missing is where do we put our mods? Because we module everything to the point of ridiculousness. So when we're on a tower, 400 apartments, we'll have kitchens, bathrooms, en-suites. We're getting to the point now, cabinetry, kit of parts type thing. They're all modules, they all interlink. You can't store them remotely because every time you go to publish or update, your computer will just sit there and you'll have 20 minutes of spinning wheel. I'll explain about BIM Cloud as well shortly, but we don't have anywhere to put those in this scenario because you can't store it in the teamwork file. It's got to be an external file, all your PDFs, DWGs, etc. So, as I said, we module a lot. When we're doing a 500 lot subdivision for houses and things, we've got facade types and things, we'll be, I don't know, I haven't done a count, but 1,000 modules, probably, 1,000 instances at least of modules in there. But yeah, easy to get up into the hundreds. So that was our big kicker as to where do we put these files, because when we're working remotely, they'd be hosted on the server with the most people, which when you're running a team which is almost 50-50, somebody's going to lose out on that scenario. Between Melbourne and Sydney, we've got a good linkage, you can kind of get away with it, but any further afield, it starts getting pretty ugly, and a lot of downtime. And we publish and update mods a lot, especially through design development phase. So into DFS. So we've got an IT service provider, Bergen CT, who are pretty awesome. I threw it to them that basically I haven't got a solution for this problem. We need some help. They went away and came back and said, well, there's this Microsoft, distributed file service. Sorry, I keep forgetting what DFS stands for. DFS runs pretty much on the same sort of backbone as Active Directory, which to explain, if I'm in the Melbourne office, I log in as Blair C on my computer. I pick up, go to the Sydney office. I use the same login in any office because they're all part of the DKO bubble. The replication that goes on for those credentials and the replication for a lot of policies and small bits of data across the offices, all the servers talk to each other through their domain services. There is ability to piggyback files on top of that. So after a bit of wrangling, they said, listen, we can create a drive which will present to your local computer like a local drive. And when you publish it, it'll be the same as publishing to your local server, because effectively it is. And so when we set this drive, because Archicad can't map to cloud locations, it can only map into a folder location, which in a Windows environment is, we've got, say, M drive or P drive, depending on which office you're in. So we'll have a projects drive, and so we'll have that file path. That file path's non-negotiable, really. So what we've got is X drive, just because we thought it was cool. It sounds a bit superhero. Also known as global share. So that's used pretty much exclusively for teamwork projects which are shared across the offices. So it presents to your computer as if it's a local drive. You publish to that. It's obviously super quick because it's just straight down to the server over here. Yeah, transfer rates are good. And then in the background, the server does a synchronization. So OneDrive, Dropbox, any of those sort of things works the same sort of fashion as that. But because it's bolted on to our standard Windows environment, it doesn't cost us anything. There's no logins or setting up accounts or anything. It just presents as a drive. And it does that and optimizes the data and squeezes it down the line. So I tried to run a couple of tests, which is impossible on a VPN, but we're talking about 6 meg a minute. Is pretty standard. Sometimes it's quicker than that, depending on how much network traffic there is, which office you're synchronizing with. But for us, it means that if I'm publishing mods in Melbourne, and generally kitchen, bathroom mods, you're talking kilobytes, it's a couple hundred kilobytes. You might get up to a meg for an apartment. You go through and publish those. By the time they've published, providing you're not getting somebody in the other office to update immediately the moment you're publishing, we're finding that that's pretty much instantaneous, or as far as the users can see, it is. And the publishing out of, like when we do PDF check sets or DWG is a bad example because we're having some issues with that, but mods, publishing them out and updating them, it's no different from being in a local server, which has eliminated that problem entirely as to where we put the mods and who's going to suffer, because you're always going to end up with one person who's going to be sitting there for half an hour watching the spinning wheel as it goes. So that's been really good. Couple of catches with it. It's got a bit of a buffer. It's like a funnel. So if you turn the tap on and it goes down the funnel, it's fine. If you tip a bucket in there, bad things start to happen. So when CGI guys dump 3 gig worth of textures into it to share it across to the Vietnam office, pretty much all the other synchronization stops at that point because it's not a big pipe. And we've had issues where things have dropped out and mods appear to be missing or corrupt. So if we treat it nicely, it's fine. We try and limit the volume of data that's on there, but more importantly, it's the volume of change of the data that's on there. And the other one to watch is you don't want to actually open files on that drive. So you don't store a PLN there and then try and work on it, because as you've got that file open, it counts against this buffer. So for us, we tend to have a fit out file on our major projects, which does kitchens, bathrooms, apartments, etc. We publish those out and then we update them in the teamwork server. We don't really ever do anything with those files. We don't open them as they are. We tend to use the publisher from the main file to make the modifications to that, which has got a raft of other benefits with attribute management and things, not having to individually update those files. You can do it all in one go. So where we're at now is not as good. Currently, we have some more shark issues. The line was supposed to be fixed as of January. We're now February, it's not. We're back up and around 250 milliseconds, which is not great. In saying that though, we haven't had any major issues. Like 200 is generally a marker that things start falling to pieces. We haven't had too many discard reloads, which is surprising because I know historically up over 200 it gets a bit sketchy. We're hoping that'll be fixed shortly. For the couple of major projects we've got going on at the moment there, we really haven't struck any issues, which is surprising because I anticipated we'd be getting squawking. The only issue we've had really is people resetting paths back to the Ho Chi Minh local drive, which caused a few issues. So we're hoping that that'll come good shortly. Once again, my favourite undersea cable website. They're always good with small pictures there. So allegedly it's going to get fixed this month now. So just to explain a couple of oddball things, our Auckland office is getting better send-receive times to our Vietnam office than Melbourne and Sydney are, even though they're on a slower internet connection, because they are going down round via Perth. Perth's getting great send-receive times at the moment. They have a pointer, but effectively, somewhere between Hong Kong and Vietnam at the moment, that's where the breakage is, whereas Perth, on the other hand, is coming up through Singapore. They're getting great speeds at the moment. So we, even last week, had the question asked, can one of the guys in the Auckland office work on the Vietnam project? It's like, yeah, absolutely, better than the guys in the Melbourne or Sydney office, just purely because of the routing. So it comes down entirely to who your ISP uses for which cables and which cables are getting eaten at the time. So hopefully that'll come good. We're currently doing an exercise with our IT guys to see whether the Melbourne-Sydney traffic can get routed through our Perth office and across, because we think we'll shave about 50 milliseconds off the time there. At this stage, it's not critical, nothing's broken yet, but if it does go down that path, we might start sending our stuff out via Perth, which seems like a really bizarre way to go, but given the current routing, that's how we're looking. Okay, enough about data. I've probably bored you to tears with that. It's kind of been the foundation of how we were doing stuff. There's a bunch of other considerations though. So, as I said, not just data. We run a Deco core template, and then we divide it up into master planning, domestic housing, commercial and interiors, and then there's localizations. Regardless of how aligned you try and be with your templates, every city's got its own things, even basic stuff like DA versus TP for design application or development application versus town planning. New Zealand's resource consent, building consent. But we try and keep the core the same, so it doesn't matter which office you're in. If you walk into a project, when you get briefed, everything looks familiar. The basic layer names are all pretty much the same. The basic attributes for building materials, the basic services, layout books and things, they're all pretty much the same. So if you come in from Ho Chi Minh and rock up in the Auckland office, you can jump in a file, it'll all look pretty much the same. We don't need to retrain people. There's a fair amount of discussion to see how that works across the company. But yeah, they've all got their own iterations, but fundamentally, if you're a DKO employee and you walk into an office and sit down in front of a computer and open a file, 90% of what you look at, or 80% of what you look at should be pretty much familiar to what you do and what you see. Next thing is we have a documentation manual and an intranet, which is shared globally. That being said, obviously, there'll be localizations of everything we do. I pity the guys in New Zealand, the volume of documentation they need to put together for a house compared to what we do. It's almost twice as many pages. Their building code is very prescriptive, and their sign-off process is done by the council themselves. And years ago, the council or councils across New Zealand got sued viciously for the leaky building syndrome. So they're very, very risk adverse. So if you do document anything in New Zealand, look forward to documenting it 1 to 5, every junction detail that's unique on your house, pages of it. But in saying that, we have a documentation manual which covers off kind of workflows and how to put things together. And we've got an intranet which deals with fun stuff like pen weights and line types and things. Hopefully, as we get better and more voluminous in our favourites, people won't even need to look at this anymore. It'll be just simply a matter of clicking on the favourite and away you go. And we try and keep our drawings graphically looking the same for each office. It doesn't always work. Sometimes we get clients who demand things in formats that we don't, would not be our DKO standard. That's caused some confusion over some of the satellite working where they've got a package of drawings to produce which is not like the other package of drawings they had to produce, even though they're the same drawings. So we've had some issues with that over time. End of the day, the next thing, come on, where you go? There we go. It's about briefing, and I've got it on my conclusions there, but clear scope and communications between the offices. There's always going to be difficulties when you cross across 2 different offices, especially different languages. All the guys in the Vietnam office are all fluent in English to varying degrees. The communication is always the key thing, that notwithstanding any internet connections and things, briefing people will quite often, if we've got a big project and it looks like the crew in Vietnam or Sydney or Melbourne or whoever office is going to do it, we'll fly the project architect to that office for a week to sit down with them, regardless of whether it's Sydney, Melbourne or Ho Chi Minh or Auckland, because having that face-to-face time to sit with the guys, get to know them, and just purely from a human point of view, getting directions from somebody you've never met to say, here, do this, here's my markups, you've made mistakes here, clean this up. If you've never met that person and had a conversation with them face-to-face, it's very easy to get quite combative with that. And we've found that sending the person over there who's running the job to whoever the crew is and spending a week with them, getting in the file with them, chatting and bits and pieces, that's gold. It absolutely makes the process so much better and so much cleaner. So the screenshot there is actually just it's a worksheet within the Normanby file. Normanby file, nice pretty picture, how it looks in real life. So that's just a quick explanation. We're getting better at putting these in. So if you're new to a file, you go to the worksheet, there's an explanation. Because our moduling structure is quite often complex, to say the least, you need a bit of a bedding in period on new project. We'll try and have a diagram as a reference point within the file, just on a worksheet, just fills and text, just to explain how things are put together. BIM management team. Whenever you're doing this, sharing projects across offices, you're going to have somebody who's assisting the staff and directing them locally, at the very least briefing them. We've got what I think is a pretty good setup. Probably didn't explain, I'm BIM manager for DKO, it's a global entity. Moyes and Damien, Sydney and Melbourne BIM managers there. We've got BIM leaders, I suppose, in the smaller offices, and we've got a gentleman by the name Joseph in our Ho Chi Minh office, who's formerly from our Melbourne office, who's heading up the team there. So we're in communication pretty regularly, not so much recently because we've been a bit slack, but usually we'll catch up over video conference. There's an inter-office resourcing video conference every week or every second week, depending on how things are going, where we'll sit down and we'll have 3-4 officers all zooming in and discussing what's coming up next. How's your office going? Have you got capacity to do more work? Have we got another project coming online? It's quite variable. The Vietnam office is very up and down. At the moment, they're probably closing in on 50-50 our work and their own local work. Other times it's been more like 90-10. I've seen some wonderful looking renders of a resort on the south coast of Vietnam. If that goes ahead, it'll probably be back to 90-10 again because they'll be flat tack doing their own work. But we try and load balance across all the offices, and we're getting better at it. We've been generally pretty good at it. We have a global resourcing schedule, which is not nearly as well frequented as it should be, but it's on me for this year to try and get everybody up to speed and using that. And it's about forecasting to know that in 2 months' time, this project's going to taper off. We're going to have 4 people available. And then next thing, it's kind of who's put their hand up for the highest bidder to take them off your hands and get them to work on their project because they're screaming for staff. Communication methods. We use, or increasingly using bullclip, which is based off a drawboard thing. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with it. Given our outputs are so heavily skewed towards 2D documentation, at the end of the day, as much as we'd like to be more BIMmy, the reality is when we're issuing drawings on AConX to the builder to build it, 90% of our scope of works is producing drawings. So we have a work flow in place which revolves around fairly old school kind of do the drawings and mark them up. So we're using this as a stamp and bullclip we're using. So we've got a number of projects live at the moment, anything from Normby to a weird looking pretzel thing in Clubhouse Willett, where basically the project architect will mark up a set of drawings that were published the night before. We've got a 4-hour time difference between Sydney, Melbourne and over to Ho Chi Minh. So they'll mark things up, and old school, they'll go through and it's a live in the cloud PDF. So when they're working on it, they go through, they run the yellow highlighter over the things. If they've got any questions, they chuck them in green. It's live real-time markups. So when it's marked up at their end, you can actually see who's put the yellow mark there and when they put it there. So they'll then publish out the new set of PDFs. The next morning, project architect will come in, review them, and generally sometime in the afternoon when there's that crossover between hours, they'll either catch up either Viber, which is nice free Wi-Fi that seems to be the part of the course in Vietnam, or they'll have a Zoom and they'll get things up on screen, they'll video conference, they'll have a chat with them, go through any issues, any queries they've got. So we'll run through a bit of a circular thing there. That's pretty much the workflow we've used right from the start with any sort of satellite office that's been working. Because of the time frame, we do find that there's questions that appear at sort of 9, 10 o'clock Melbourne time, which can't be answered because people are generally home by that point, generally. So they'll publish and they'll leave the notes on there, and then come sort of 11 o'clock in the morning our time, we'll jump on board and answer any queries from there. So I'll just see if I can grab this quickly. So if you haven't looked at Drawboard, please feel free to have a look. Trial license, I think, is 14 days. So if I zoom in, this is kind of live, odd-looking building that we're doing. And you can track back through, that was the first round of markups. And if I have a look there, I can see that Vu has done the markups. He's done all the work on that drawing. And then Richard Todd's project architect on that one. And then you could look at the latest revision, which I don't think's been worked on yet. Maybe it has. And you can also put comments down the side. So we've found that from the initial markup rounds where Sky One was print drawings out, mark them up, scan them back in, email them across to Vietnam. They'd print them out, put them on their desk. Not a very eco-friendly way of doing things, and pretty tired and cumbersome from there. So it was, yeah, we'd like to think we've modernised our techniques a little bit. Okay, so key points. If you're looking at sharing across Office, do a bit of research, find out what's out there. The internet line you are on may not be the best option. Definitely, if you've got an IT service provider, ask them lots of questions. There's quite often more ways of doing things than you would expect. So definitely ask. Way to numbers, I mentioned before. If you're going to host a file somewhere, then please put it in the best location for the most amount of staff, not necessarily the most senior staff, because sometimes there's a bit of a conflict with that. But we've been pretty good. Our project architects are generally understanding of the fact that they're not going to get the best file speed because you've got 5 people over there working their butts off to get the deadlines met for you. So you should be looking after them, not yourself. Communication. Keep talking. Zoom we've found is leaps and bounds better than Skype. We've quite regularly have 4 or 5 officers all linked in on a Zoom, and we can all chat pretty clearly and have a good shot at actually communicating things clearly across and making sure that everybody's on the same page, because for the sake of a 5-minute conversation, you could have 20 emails and still not get to the same resolution. Control your files. Clean files are quick files. If you find that you've got massive amounts of attributes or extra libraries and these things you don't need, every process you do on that file will slow down. It'll get pretty ugly. Now these guys I just kind of slid in here because I didn't really know where else to go, but it's probably a quick little summary of learnings for us as to what configurations we've had. We've got satellite offices which don't have a server of themselves. We just have a VPN unit which basically brings all our signals through rather than them VPNing directly into the office themselves. They're in a little bubble and that VPN talks to that. So Christchurch office works that way. They don't have a server. They just VPN directly across to the Auckland server. Small office, we've managed to cobble together a PC as a teamwork server and a NAS as a file server. It's a bit ugly, it's a bit clunky, but it does work, and it's a bucket load cheaper than buying a server and setting it up. Medium office will generally run a server, a single unit, and there'll be a couple of virtual machines on that. We'll run one as a BIM server and one as a file server. Good, but it's a single point of failure. If it fries itself, you're in some serious trouble because there's no coming back from that. You'll have to go to your backups and rebuild it. And anything other than that, we run what's called a SAN, which is, I don't even know what the acronym stands for, basically a big block of data storage. And then we have controllers on top of that, which virtualize servers. If they go down, they can be back up in the space of 10 minutes. Because they're not actually a server, they're running a server as a surface, basically. The other thing we've got at the moment between Sydney and Melbourne, we've got 100% replication. So if the Melbourne office was to blow up, the Sydney servers will actually have a cached version of everything in Melbourne. It's about a 1-hour turnaround from that. So if things went horribly wrong, we had an office offline for 2 weeks due to natural disaster or major power failure or something along those lines, we can actually re-image the Melbourne servers in the Sydney and vice versa. As to where we'd sit everybody, I'm not sure how that would work, but at the very least we could prioritise what we're doing. The SANs typically do not fail. We've never had a SAN fail. The IT guys that we deal with haven't had one either. The virtual service, if the server itself crashes, it's not a real server, it's basically a virtual machine. So you can boot it back up, it starts back up. It's some of the time we've had them go down, nobody's even noticed. So that's fine. The other thing I'll just quickly touch on, I haven't got a slide on it, the elephant in the room, why aren't we using BIM Cloud? Because we're using BIM Server for everything, we don't have BIM Cloud Pro. Couple of main things, it's quite expensive. When you've got 143 licenses and you times that by a BIM Cloud license on top, it's pretty expensive. The other thing is it doesn't host mod files, and because we mod so much, other than some admin management, there's probably not a huge benefit for us at the moment. Obviously, shortly, that probably won't be an issue at all, and we'll reevaluate our options maybe after July this year. But at this stage, the fact that BIM Cloud's not really cloudy enough for us, we're just not going to go that way. But in saying that, typically if you buy a big server, you've got a 3, 4, maybe 5, if you're lucky, time span on it before you have to redo it. It's a pretty big outlay. So given the fact that Melbourne and Sydney are on super fast 1,000 by 1,000 lines now, I think by the time we get to our servers reaching end of life, we'll start moving more and more stuff up to the cloud. So email exchange, so when the Sydney power goes out, we don't lose it for a day. And also BIM Cloud, because it'll be fair and equitable access for everybody, because it'll actually be cloud. So thoroughly looking forward to that. Still will need to put a business case as to why we're spending so much more money on that. But in lieu of buying hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of dollars of new hardware to replace servers in the offices, I'm hoping that'll be an easy sell. Yeah. Come on, you can do it. There we go. CBD questions. They're in the downloads. Feel free to fill them out. There shouldn't be anything too technical in there. I was struggling to find really specifically CPD relevant questions. So you've just got a random assortment of questions in there. Answer them at your will. Okay, over to you. Questions?
When dealing with a huge amount of mod files,
Yep.
you save them as .mods, and do you locate them to the main project and annotate them there, or how do you deal with annotations on the
Mostly labeling. We don't carry a lot of annotations in there. Our mods have got two faces, basically. Generally, they've got the I'm going to the major master file face, which is you might only see 10 elements in the mod. And then we have the I'm being documented face, and you'll have your dimensions, notations, and things like that. So when we export out our mods, we generally try and keep them as light as possible, because when you've got like 800 bathrooms across the housing subdivision, you want as little data as possible to go across. Generally, we can keep it down into the hundreds of kilobytes. But in saying that, if we're doing a bathroom mod, we'll try and only document it once ever. So all that additional notation and bits and pieces, which doesn't go to the main file, quite regularly it'll travel via PMK to the layout book, because a lot of our files will end up with a layout book on the basis that when you're combining 400 houses, you don't want to have the layout book and the master file in the same place, because your computer will melt. It's just too big. So,
Is there a reason why you don't run your BIM servers as standalones instead of, in terms of safety mechanism, in terms of having it as a virtual server inbuilt with your file server? One of the things we've always done is kept it as its own unique box.
As a different piece of hardware?
Yeah.
The controllers take care of that. So effectively, Melbourne, Sydney, we've got two controllers. They can do each other's jobs. So they're on a separate virtual server. They're on the same piece of hardware. If the sand blows up, then we're in some serious trouble, obviously. But in the history of, sands, it hasn't been an issue. Because we've got dual controllers, if the, say, MelBIM, the 21 BIM server in Melbourne fails, that controller's fried. The other controller can pick that up and re-image it almost instantaneously.
As soon as the hardware's installed,
yeah. Basically, because it's, I don't know, easy way to say, it's a hologram. Your computer looks at it like a server. It's not really a server. It just presents as a server, and you're talking 10 to 15 minute turnaround. So it's quite agile.
Any other questions? Even though we're actually on time, it's good.
I know.
You did really well.
Yeah.
First time, and you do it better than me, mate. You're a professional.
I was watching the counter. I didn't talk for half an hour prior, though.
All right, so thanks very much, Blair, for your presentation, mate. It's great, mate.